One of the questions I had was about a bit about the daily routines of the lookouts, and a little bit about how what the facilities were like on the lookouts.
Well, daily routines. There was always a schedule to maintain first thing in the morning with the Forest Ranger's office, and that was laid out ahead of time on a basis of first this man, then the next lookout, and then the next lookout. You see, because they're all on the same frequency, and this is when we were on shortwave radio. Later on, when FM radio came in, well, didn't really make that much difference because there wasn't that much interference between one set of radio communications and the next. Mm-hmm. But the daily routine, apart from those schedules and keeping watch for fires, consisted of nothing much more, I suppose, than maintaining his lookout in the way of if he had a wood stove, well, he had wood to cut and carry. Almost invariably, they had to carry water. And from one lookout to the next, it would vary somewhat because some lookouts were extremely popular with the public. A typical example of that was the one at New Denver called Idaho. Hardly a day would go by, in the summer months, but what someone wouldn't appear on the scene. And of course, they would take up the lookout man's time. Forest Service never did object to it because they were the best public relations men in the world, some of them.
So you would phone them or call them up on the radio in the morning just to check in that they were.
Yeah, every day. If they didn't come on at the time prescribed, we would try to contact them again at some point or the other during the day. And if there was no contact, well, we knew there was a problem. Mm-hmm. The problem could be with the man himself, or it could be just simply radio's gone on the fritz. But of course you had to find out. I don't know how much of a story I could tell you on one particular subject. How much time would you like to take?
Well, if you've got a story, I'd love to hear it.
Well, I mentioned before that these men on the mountain were special type of people. And one of the reasons that they are special is because they have to adapt to living at a high altitude. Now, this sounds a little bit strange when you first hear it, but it's an honest to goodness fact that initially, at least, when a person goes to the top of the mountain to live for a while, their brain is actually suffering from the shortage of oxygen. The shortage of oxygen in the blood. Now, I could tell you a much longer story in connection with that, because having been a pilot in World War II, they gave us this experience. And we found out that beyond an elevation of 15,000 feet, we just did not function normally at all. And there was no way in the world could you function normally. And you had to turn your oxygen on to supplement the shortage of oxygen. Okay, to a lesser degree perhaps, but on the Forest Service lookouts, the same darn thing happened. And I got a brand new man. I put him up on the lookout. I went up there with him. I told him of all the things he had to do. And I said, now, beyond anything else, you must communicate with us on schedule the first thing in the morning. Well, first thing in the morning rolled around, no communication. So what's the problem? I went up the top up to the lookout, and the food supplies and the groceries, which we had delivered by helicopter, incidentally, were still sitting outside of the lookout building. And I thought, my God, what's happened to this fellow? Anyway, just at that moment, he appeared in the door, and he looked at me with the strangest look on his face, as if to say, what are you guys doing here? You know, that kind of an expression. That man was suffering from oxygen shortage. He hadn't even taken his supplies into the building. I said, well, why didn't you turn your radio on and call us? Oh, he said, I really didn't have that much to say, he said, so I thought I wouldn't bother. So anyway, eventually, it takes about a week to 10 days for a man to adapt to that kind of a life. And one of the problems is that oxygen shortage. Another problem associated with altitude is how in the heck do you boil potatoes at 6,000 feet? Have you ever heard the problems, eh? Mm-hmm. Yeah. You can boil them for about 3 hours. And finally, the provincial government saw the light and gave each lookout man a pressure cooker to cook his potatoes in. But it took a lot of talking to get them to do it. You see, down to Victoria at sea level, they didn't understand the problem. And finally, when I wrote down and showed them how much it was costing them in propane gas and how much it cost to transport propane gas up for a 3-hour session with a potato pod as compared to what it would do in 4 minutes, they saw the light. Yeah. So where were we?
Well,
routine.
The routine. And so most of the thunderstorms are in the afternoon, aren't they?
Not necessarily. No, not necessarily. But yes, mostly. But certainly you can have them in the middle of the night. Mm-hmm. And when that would occur, there were various ways that the lookout man would have of trying to memorize the location of where the strikes were. And one cute little trick that one lookout man had is he had one little black marking pencil. Mm-hmm. And when there was a strike come, well, he'd be standing beside his firefinder. Well, he'd go over and he'd put an X on the window. And there was the direction of one strike, and then an X would show the direction of another one. And next morning, when the light was suitable, well, then you'd start to look.
So they must have had to find their own ways of
yeah, some of them had some pretty good ideas, but that's the one that I remember.
So once they started spotting fires, then would they call you?
Oh yes, yeah. They would call the ranger headquarters, which of course in fire season always had a man on duty on the radio, mm-hmm. Up until quite late at night if the need existed. Mm-hmm. If there were the other situation, of course, could develop is that once when we had the AM radios, in particular the shortwave, one lookout could communicate with another, and if there was no response from the lookout's headquarters, he could call another lookout man who in turn would probably get communication with his, and next thing you know, somebody would be on deck on the phone, you see. So it all worked out good. There was very, very seldom, if ever, occasion when lookout man couldn't get some form of a response.
What were the facilities like on the lookout?
Oh, well, the They were usually a 12 by 12 or 12 by 14 building, and the cook stoves were initially coal and wood, and where the odd lookout existed that had a road to it, the fuel line was no problem. But others we found that worked better than someone designed and built a small oil stove, fuel oil stove. And then later we ended up with propane stoves and even propane heaters. And on good many of the lookouts we had propane refrigerators. So much for comforts and cooking. And apart from his bed, I guess that's about all he needed, eh?
Some were actually towers, steel towers, and others were just on the ground.
I don't know whether the Forest Service in our district ever had steel towers. Mm-hmm. Some of the first buildings were, they would pick a couple of convenient trees and then add to them in the way of other trees, and next thing you knew they had a tower made out of strictly logs. Mm-hmm. The first one of the first lookouts that I ever went up to was called Blackwater Lookout, and that was built exactly like that. But there was no building on the top of it, only a platform. Mm-hmm. And he had radio communication, but he would have to come down off his platform to get to communicate. I believe there was one Forest Service lookout that was put on a prefabricated tower, but it was prefabricated out of wood, and that was Sentinel Mountain. Mm-hmm. In later years, and I believe that probably, I don't know whether I should take full credit for it or not, because it might have been a combination of myself and a fellow by the name of Herb Cooling. But the two of us designed a lookout tower base made out of cinder blocks. And we had a carpenter crew in those days, and they would build up the tower to the height that they wanted, sometimes as much as 24 feet high, and then put the building itself, the prefabricated building, was put on top of the cinder block tower. And of course they had an inside stairway, and another advantage to them is that they could lock them up. They had a locking type door. That type of the building almost invariably had a catwalk around the outside. Mm-hmm. The ones that were just sitting right on the rocks, and there were a few of those. Of course, they didn't need catwalks. Now, I don't know how many of those lookouts were eventually equipped with cement or cinder blocks, but I was involved with at least 3. The one on Lemon Lookout was converted to rebuilt after it had been hit by lightning and blown apart. It was rebuilt onto cinder blocks rather than wood. Copper Lookout, which is one that we had here at Nelson, it was rebuilt onto blocks. And the one at Salmo, Beaver Lookout, it was done the same way. Did you want to hear about the one that got hit by lightning?
Sure. Is that common?
No. But this is a thing that really got me into trouble. But one of my assistant rangers called me up one day and he said, "How about bringing the lookout man down for a break?" I said, "By all means." The weather had been rainy and wet. He was sitting up there in the clouds. So I said, "Sure, bring him down for a few days." So anyway, when they went back up to, after the rains were over, I went back up to the lookout. The thing wasn't there. It had been struck by lightning and burned. And so I got onto the telephone. Excuse me. So anyway, I got on the telephone and I called the Nelson headquarters and I told them that I was sorry to report that we didn't have a lookout anymore. So then I asked him, I said, "Did you want a report on it?" And the fellow answered, "No, I don't think so." So anyway, next morning I thought I'd better sit down and put in a report on it, which I did. And I can still remember the way I started out the letter report. I said, "This report, although not called for, is being written to demonstrate the inadequacy of the lightning arrestor system on our Forest Service lookouts." Well, I opened up a can of worms that you wouldn't believe. There was a full investigation went into the installation and the demonstration of the adequacy or otherwise of the lightning arrestor system. Now, I never did get my way, but I maintained that what we had was not a lightning arrestor, but a lightning attractor. And if you know anything about the early days of Canadian farming, you'll perhaps recall that what they used to call drummers used to go around selling these things they call lightning arrestors to the farmers to put up on their silos, which is always the highest point on a farm. And they were finding they were burning down more silos with these lightning arrestors on than they had when they were not on. So then finally somebody smartened up and they put the lightning arrestor over to one side of the silo, not on the silo itself, and let the lightning hit that, and from then on they had no more trouble. Well, if it was true with the silos in the farmers' fields, why wasn't it true with the Forest Service lookouts? Why shouldn't they put the lightning arrestor off to one side rather than on the building? But I never did get my way. But anyway, what I finally did on Lemon Lookout, I concluded that the reason why the lightning arrestor system had not worked properly is that it had difficulty going to ground. So what I did is I took two 45-gallon galvanized oil drums and I dug them into the ground and buried them and ran the lightning arrestor wire system into ground inside of the barrel, which meant then that the soil would always be damp rather than to drain away and dry out. You see, the lack of moisture, in the opinion of a number of people, was what was the reason why the lightning arrestor system didn't work properly. It needed that little bit of extra moisture in order to go to ground. And there was never any more problem. But the fact is, it did happen.
You must have been very glad that you decided to give the guy a couple of days off.
That was another question I had to answer. Where was the lookout man when it got hit? But I don't know even now too much about lightning in respect to why and where it hits where it does. But I read that in actual fact the the place where the lightning strikes is predetermined by the bleeding off from the earth itself of what they call ions or protons or something like that. And what happens, this thing starts to build and build and build. They call it a corona. And finally it gets up high enough so that the counter charge from the cloud, which is usually, I think, positive, comes down and hits in the spot where that corona started. Mm-hmm. Well, the top of a mountain is the perfect place for it to happen, eh? And this lightning arrestor system that we had on the lookouts was the perfect place for it to start. So why shouldn't it get hit? No, these are all personal opinions. Nobody could ever prove to me that I was wrong. But on the other hand, there's really no way of proving that I'm right either.
Did the firefinder equipment change over the years?
Not a great deal. I'm trying to think the name of the machine that we used to have. It's gone. But originally what they did is they set a map up on a flat surface with directional areas from the center being the location of where the lookout was on the map. And then they had this little movable machine which they could swing around with a cross, with a hair on one end and a slot on the other, and they would look through it to line up on a fire. And then they run a parallel out on the map itself and come up with a bearing. Well, someone in the Forest Service, I think his name was Bennett, he designed and built right in the Forest Service Marine Workshop a machine which it was called a firefinder, which was absolutely superb. It was all made out of cast aluminum, and all of the bearings and everything else were, a 360-degree bearing was on it, and it had something like a telescope sight deal, although it did not magnify, but it was very much like what you would see in a telescope sight on a rifle. And it had an offset. You could swing it one way or the other for no other reason than the fact that in front of you at some time or other was a window and its sash on the side. So you would just move it over and you could see what was behind the window sash. Mm-hmm. And so that was really the only changes that I ever noticed. I've forgotten now what the name of this machine was originally, but the new one was called Firefinders Forest Service Bennett or something to that effect. The big plate was about 20 inches in diameter, and it would have a 4 mile to inch scale map on it right underneath the whole thing, so that all you had to do was look and see where the mark was on it, and you could come up with a fire location, nothing flat.
Was it hard to get firefighting crews together at times?
Well, I suppose you would say yes at times. One of the easiest places that I ever had to gather firefighting crews in, would you believe, Lardo? There were something like between 34 and 40 able-bodied men in the Lardo area that could fight fire, who, when called upon, would have to go. And I established a list of these people, put their names right on the list, And if I needed 5 men, well, I'd take the first 5, and the next fire that came up, well, I'd take the next 5 or 6, and so on. And everybody got a rotation at it. Nobody was hit any harder than the next guy. And it worked so well that I used to have fellas coming in to take a look at the list to see when their name was coming up next. But on the other hand, places like Creston, the devil's own job trying to get firefighters at times, because they'd be working in the orchards, in virtually an essential occupation. I mean, if the fruit farmer wasn't harvesting his fruit right at that particular moment, he's going to lose it. He couldn't afford to lose the manpower. And surprising how many of the able-bodied people around Creston worked in the fruit growing industry. So there you are. Before the fruit harvesting season, there was no problem getting firefighters. And even after that, if the occasion warranted it. But it was harder to get firefighters there than it was in Lardo. Mm-hmm.
Did you do you have recollections of some of the first times using aircraft, employing aircraft, and having to work out the routines and how to use them in a?
Oh, let's see now. Well, with the aircraft itself, I suppose that the biggest use came when they were delivering supplies to firefighters by parachute. And that was pretty highly and well organized. We actually employed people right in the main office, and the aircraft was based here at Nelson. We actually employed people for the summer as observers in the aircraft when I was patrolling, and they were also adept at and strong enough to become involved in the process of supply dropping. Mm-hmm. And the parcels were done up in cardboard boxes, strapped with a strapping machine to keep them from bursting open. And at the same time, as they were strapped, they were attached to the harness of these war surplus parachutes. Mm-hmm. And it took quite a lot of jury rigging of the original parachute to come up with a satisfactory method of using them for our purpose. The original parachute, of course, was packed by experts, and the result was that very few, if any, of them ever failed to open. But that was too much of an involved process for us. And we came up with a system whereby we had a bag. No, it was probably, depending on the size of the parachute, there was at least three different sizes of parachute. One was I believe 12 feet across, and another one about 15 or 18. And then I think there was the personnel chute, which was around about 32. And they made canvas bags out of old tents that were no longer suitable for the tent function. Mm-hmm. They used the canvas to make bags, and then they would pack the parachute into the bag itself, and then using a piece of grocery string, they would attach the top of the parachute to the inside of the bag, which in turn then was attached to a rope, so that when it was dropped through the hatch, the parcel and the bag would drop through the hatch of the aircraft. the parcel would drop about 10 feet. Then it would start to pull out the parachute, and eventually it would all come out, and the piece of grocery string would snap, and bingo, away would go the parachute. And then you would retract the strap and the bag and put it back into the airplane.
This went through a hatch in the floor?
Yeah. Huh. So, as you can well imagine, the man who was doing the dropping had to be a pretty husky young individual. And the pilot would line himself up with the proper place, and he would have to use the the fellow would have to be strong enough to handle that. But they used to weigh them up about 110 pounds apiece, anywhere from 60 to 110, depending on the size of chute. And the pilot would give him the word when to drop, and then he'd be standing there holding it. And then when the pilot said drop, all down it would go. He would even give it a good push, because sometimes the slipstream would otherwise jam the parcel into the hole, with it being partly in and partly out. And there's been times when the guy had to give it an extra kick to get it to loosen up. So I don't think they ever had any serious accidents dropping in that manner, but sometimes I wonder why. I've seen some fantastic things happen. Like one time, I guess one of the cardboard boxes must have got a little damp. I think it had been sitting on a damp floor or something overnight, and it was loaded up with potatoes and canned foods and so on and so forth. And we were dropping that particular load of supplies on a fire way up Wilson Creek, one of the forks of Wilson Creek. And as the parachute opened, there's enough of a jar so that everything just spilled right out. And of course, they must have been anywhere from 500 to 1,000 feet above the ground when they turned this loose. And the crew on the ground didn't realize that the parcel had split open. And with it now being nothing more than a light balloon, there was enough updraft running up the mountain so that instead of the parachute going down, the darn thing was going up. The last I saw of it was a couple of firefighters running up the mountain trying to catch that parachute. Oh dear.
Meanwhile, it was raining potatoes.
Yeah.
Huh.
I think perhaps I think probably I was one of the most heavily involved in the initial delivery of supplies by helicopter. Mm-hmm. And as you can well imagine, back in the first earlier days of the helicopter, Forest Service was, I believe, just a little bit reluctant to spend as much money as they were spending on the helicopter. I don't think it's any problem now, but initially it was. And the result is that we very, very highly organized our helicopter delivery system. And when we rebuilt the lookout tower on Beaver Lookout, we took in all of the cinder blocks as opposed to cement blocks because they're lighter. We took those in to the lookout. we took in gravel, we took in sand, gravel to make the cement, sand to mix the mortar, to put the cinder blocks together, and we took in lumber and plywood and the prefabricated lookout. And it was all organized from the end of the existing road on the way up to Beaver Lookout to the lookout itself. Now, it wasn't a heck of a lot of distance as a crow flies, but in elevation it was probably about 1,500 feet. And we delivered those supplies in about 10 hours of flying time, which I later sat down and calculated how long it would take to have done it. The same thing with pack horses, and it would have taken a string of 4 pack horses 2 months to put the same supplies onto the lookout. So there was really no comparison. But we were very, very highly organized. And as a matter of fact, the pilot, who was a cigarette smoker in those days, he says, "Well," he says, "I don't care about you guys," he says, "but I'm shutting down for a smoke." Because we weren't giving him a second's rest, you know. But we even took water in, you know, to mix the cement. I think I could talk for days on the subject of helicopters and supply delivery.
Did you do much flying yourself to either to see what was going on within your district, or?
Well, every opportunity I had to inspect a fire from the air, I took the opportunity. And I believe it was a very, very time-saving and time-saving device. With a fairly good knowledge of the district in which I was operating, I could go in with a pilot and have a look at the fire and figure out the best way to get into it, which in itself could save hours. And which of course means you're saving not only money, but saving the possibility of the fire getting away at the same time. So every opportunity I had to check a fire from the air, I did. Of course, flying was no new experience for me. I had 1,400 hours in the war, so it was neither a novelty or a problem.
Would they land float planes in New Denver on the lake and pick you up?
Yeah. All they'd have to do is come into the wharf at New Denver, and I'd be waiting for them. Away we'd go. The same would apply here in Nelson. Actually, when I was in Lardo, yes, we were using Beaver. Yeah, that's right. But we only had 12 small fires the year I was in Lardo, so I didn't really need the plane that much. I think I was only up in it once when we had a fire up Poplar Creek. If you ever get an opportunity to fly up towards the head of Poplar Creek, don't turn it down. It's really a fantastic sight. There's 3 lakes up there, and each one is a settling pond for the one in front of it. The first one is always a dull kind of blue-gray color. The next one is kind of a blue color, and the next one is most incredible blue-green color that you could ever think of looking at. Each one being a settling pond for the other. Of course, I was up there and no camera. I never got a chance to go back.
when they replaced the lookouts or used aircraft more and were manning the lookouts less, were there some things that the lookouts could do better for which you missed them?
Well, I was of the old school, and even now I still think that letting those lookouts go might have been a mistake. The reason for it is just simply this, is that I know of aircraft that have flown over fires that a lookout man has been reporting. The aircraft has flown over them and not been able to see them. And simply because at that particular moment the smoke wasn't coming up. 5 minutes later it was, but now the airplane has gone by. So really, rather than to say that the aircraft is no substitute for lookouts, I would say that a combination of the two was really the best. But for probably all too many reasons, they've allowed to close them down. I really don't know whether they have any left in operation or not. I'm not up to date on that subject. But I know I was around when they started to let them go. Another one of the reasons why. One time we had a series of fires reported by the lookout man on Beaver Lookout down at Salmo. And the fires were up a place called Hidden Creek. And we got the reports from the lookout man when I was returning from delivering men and supplies to another fire down near the international boundary. So I happened to be in the helicopter at the time. And he reported 3 fires on Hidden Creek. Started up that afternoon. So we flew up Hidden Creek looking for these fires. We never saw a darn one of them. We turned around and came back down and found all 3 of them. Now the reason for it is that in one instance we were looking into the sun, and in the other instance the sun was at our back. And strangely enough, the easiest way and the best way to see fires is when you're looking into the sun. You'd think it would be the other way around.
Does that mean that for a lookout at different times of day they could spot fires in different areas of their...
That's right, yeah. He would have 2 quadrants, of course, depending on where the sun was. And in the morning, one side would be easier to spot fires, and vice versa in the afternoon. So actually high noon was probably the best time. But you would still be looking into the sun at some time or other, even at high noon.
This is a little bit off topic, but something I've gotten interested in and through conversations in the last week or two is the use of flumes in logging. And when you were cruising or out in the bush, did you often come across old flumes that had been used previously for logging?
The only place that I ran across a flume was up the Little Moye River. Do you know where that Little Moye River is?
Yes, I think.
Yeah. It took logs to a place called Lumberton. Now, on the other hand, they used not flumes, but chutes. And in the early days of logging in Slocan, the main product was cedar poles. And there was still, you could still see some of the constructed chutes where they would use a horse to bring the poles out to one central point, and then these chutes would take they would somehow or other they'd get these cedar poles onto these chutes, and they would go right down into the lake. They had to be quite specifically constructed too, because at the bottom they had to be made like a ski jump. Because if they went straight into the lake like that, it would smash the log up and hit the water. Nothing harder than water, you know.
Well, I'm trying to understand how common this was
these chutes, you mean?
Where they would use it and where they wouldn't.
Well, I found several places on Slocan Lake, on the other side of the lake from where the highway is, where they had used these chutes. And the last one that I know of that they built and used a chute on for logs, it was done by the logging company at Slocan. I'm trying to think what their name was at that time. I guess it was Hicks Brothers Sawmill. And they actually had horse logged one side hill, and they had built a chute to take the logs down into the lake. And that's the last one that I ever saw. And that, of course, had to be sometime during the 1950s.